Welcome to the Grinders Table, the podcast where we sit with C-suite executives and founders who are taking their industry by storm to figure out how you can build an exceptional career and business. Together, we'll try to uncover how they are both defying the odds and what you can learn from their experience. Our guest today is building Africa's first direct air capture company in Kenya. But his journey didn't begin in Africa. It actually began in Austria. Now he's leading a team of 50 people in building what has become Africa's most significant climate tech companies, one of which I greatly admire. I'm going to pause here and allow Martin introduce himself.
Hi, thank you so much for that very kind intro. I'm Martin. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Octavia Carbon. And yes, we are building Africa's and the Global South's first direct air capture company in Kenya. Originally from Austria, and had the pleasure of spending 2 years of my youth on the African continent, one in South Africa and one in Zambia. And also met my German wife in Tanzania that year, and that is now 11 years ago in 2014. And then sort of went to the UK for 7 years, studied in Cambridge, worked in London as a strategy consultant for a while, specialized on carbon and sort of became the global consulting firm's carbon guy, basically the expert on what sort of like impacts carbon market could have on livelihoods creation, especially in Africa. And then over time realized that there's a lot of like pretty significant and fundamental issues with like the carbon markets that we have today, and that they need much more durable forms of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. That one technology to do that is called direct air capture, and I'm sure we get to that in more detail. But that Kenya is also the world's best place for it, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a lot more detail. But it's essentially because it fits like energy, geology, and talent. And then I did the logical thing and moved my life to Kenya about 3.5 years ago. And still with my former employer, Dahlberg, that consultancy, and then also started working on Octavia quite soon afterwards. Yeah, I mean, the rest is sort of pretty much history. I met my co-founder, Duncan, on a sort of like online community of direct air capture nerds, and we started chatting. He's an engineer, so it was a good fit. And yeah, we started 2.5 years ago at my kitchen table, about 50, coming up to 60 people, and have the world's second direct air capture and geological storage plant in Kenya.
Lovely. So one of the things I like to do is dig into people's upbringing, and I did a bit of research, and I saw that your dad was a train driver, and I've been wondering, how did that influence your worldview, or how did that influence how your life has turned?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I'm not sure that like it has in some ways, like I think I sort of like much of my sort of childhood like wanting to sort of like go away again. When I went to South Africa in my youth, I was 16 and then went by myself in this sort of exchange year, staying with the host family when I was there. So in some ways, I think I always felt like my sort of surroundings were a bit too small for me, and I think that I did have potential that I'd want to sort of bring to the world. So I think the impact might have been indirect. My dad was a very decent man. He always looked after his family. Like he did sort of take his responsibility as his father, like, bringing income home. Like he took that very seriously. But, he never finished high school, and there was never much that I could sort of talk about with him as pertains to my work, as sort of like concerns the ambitions that I had as a teenager. And so in some ways, I think maybe like that sort of working class upbringing did sort of like nudge me towards entrepreneurship in a certain way, which is that like I always felt like I don't like the limits put on me by sort of random institutions. Like, when I first joined that started the university. I mean, Cambridge is a very sort of, well, I can imagine sort of historical institutional place, and you kind of always feel out of place there. But especially if you're, again, like if your parents didn't go to university and like it's just kind of random person on a scholarship going there, like was so. But I think even after that, like in the corporate world, again, there's like people you work with, and some people are like just like kind of fancier than others, and those people sort of seem to have it a bit easier. And I don't know, like I think that the thing that somewhat appealed to me of entrepreneurship is that ultimately, like, you are your own limiting factor, right? Like, it ultimately is the test of whether you can sort of bring value to the world in a unique way that hasn't been done before. And it's hard. It's really like testing. And even then, there's like a lot of like, inequalities and so on in venture capital, some of which I've definitely benefited from. But overall, I think it's just sort of been a good fit for me. And I think I've always liked building organizations, even sort of like in school and then later in university, I was sort of quite involved in student politics and so on. Always liked the sort of like the building aspect. And yeah, and I think that's something that sort of like I brought with me from my childhood, basically. But yeah, it's I always struggle a bit to say what impact my parents had on me, other than like, providing me with a very decent sort of stable home when I was young, and like just sort of getting the basics right. And I think a lot of the rest sort of like set me up for like, expressing more individuality, that sort of ultimately led to Octavia as well.
I'd like to drill on a statement you made, which is you are your limiting factor. When did this realization hit you, where you're like, maybe I could be way more. Maybe I'm the one limiting myself and not the environment that I find myself in.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think it sort of maybe started from the time when I was about 16 or so. Again, even some years before then, the drinking age in Austria is 16. And so like teenagers in sort of working class settings start drinking before then. And I sort of kind of like went down that route when I was like 14, 15, which sounds a bit wild. And found that pretty empty and vacuous. And I think eventually was like, actually, like I have more in me than this. And so like when I was 16, I was eventually sort of like getting pretty serious about like exercising, like taking school a bit more serious, and ultimately like just looking for opportunities elsewhere. And yeah, I think that ultimately sort of like led me to South Africa, where I was lucky to be in a very good school. And that also just kind of like really helped me in, I think just fully believing in my potential, and not being afraid of the potential that I have. Well, I mean, in the sense that like, I guess at school I would have been bullied for like, being smart, which is not a nice thing. And it's also just so stupid, so bizarre and stupid. So I think, again, maybe the school in South Africa sort of like released that a bit more. And so at some point, and this is a true story, it might sound exaggerated, like at some point we were like my classmates at South Africa were applying to university. And then for me, that was still like a year and a half away at that point, because I know I would have to go back to Austria and I would have to do military service after that, because Austrian men have to. And so I was kind of like Googling world's best universities, and Cambridge came up on top. And found a course that I liked, and I kind of like set my eyes on actually like doing that very course. And I did. So in some ways, I think it kind of shows that, like life isn't always like a picture book, but like I think if you really set your mind on something, then, and you sort of are willing to put the work against it, then many things are possible. And again, I think I always hesitate saying these words because, of course, everyone's contexts are very different, right? Like I was Austrian, UK was part of the EU at that time. I sort of had a relatively easy time getting a visa to the UK and studying there and so on, which, would be very different for a lot of the people hearing this. So in some ways, again, like it's always easy for like, a white sort of middle class guy to tell you that like, it's all up to the work you put in and so on. And then I'm aware that it's often more complicated than that. But I do think there's like a kernel of truth there, which is that there's lots of like limitations that I had. I was not a native English speaker, but studied like an essay subject at university. Like I had like my parents never went to university, never even encouraged me to study hard either. But ultimately, like I did those things. So like you can always find reasons why you can't succeed. Ultimately, like it's always down to like you to actually to take what you've been given and to make the most out of it.
Yeah. So you're a young man, thrown into South Africa. What was that experience like? How did you adapt to the culture, the sunlight? How did that experience influence you?
Yeah, no. So for any South African listeners, I was in Pietermaritzburg, which then is like a funny town, like some was like, again, sort of in the middle, but it had some very good schools. I was in a school called Maritzburg College at that time, big rugby school, and also like a very strict culture. So you would have to wear like these hats called bashers outside of school when you're wearing a school uniform. You'd have to sort of like greet the teachers. It was an all boys school, and like you'd have to treat the older kids with a lot of respect and so on. Well, yeah, I think there was definitely a bit of a culture shock in there, but like I think I sort of very clearly sort of like turned out to just really love that. Basically, like in some ways, it's The one thing that I then sort of did pretty quickly is that sort of like they had sort of like they separated the classes by like bottom sets and top sets and sort of in between sets or whatever. And I just sort of like managed to get into top sets for all of my classes. And yeah, I mean, all of a sudden they were like great discussions led by students in the classroom, and it was wild. Like it was like actually so like such an intellectual atmosphere, much as like that school like rightfully has a reputation for being a big rugby school. But like it was also like just that sort of like notion of like sort of like small students sort of studying together, and I think just like helping each other like grow and so on. That was like really fantastic. So in some ways, like I don't know, like I don't know if I sort of experienced the sort of like culture shock that much. Basically, I think I've sort of like slid from a sort of like middle class setting into again something of a middle class setting again. I mean, like the school that I was in was definitely good, but again I stayed in like a sort of 2-bedroom like apartment, like without a garden or anything. So like while my dad was a land surveyor for the local utility Escom, and so like it was all like I don't know, it's hard to sort of put my finger on it. I guess there was definitely like a lot of like difference, but ultimately like it felt like, and I think maybe like it's kind of hard to like tell that in retrospect, just because like so much of like that year shaped me so much that it's just such an ingrained part of my identity, and I don't even perceive of it as like that different in many ways. And again, like I still like even among the Austrian exchange students that I sort of like went with, I mean, some of them like ended up in townships in South Africa and say the Cape Flats, which are sort of very sort of like rather rough areas. And again, their experience was quite different from mine. So I didn't have as much of a sort of culture difference. Again, in South Africa, it was a bit of a, well, it was like a stayed with like a white host father and a sort of another Canadian exchange student as a host brother, so to say. And again, in South Africa, it is sort of like, I mean, I don't want to. I don't like. I certainly don't want to get like tangled up in like South Africa's race politics here. And but by no means an expert. But it's also like it was in some ways like it was a sort of weird continuation of sort of like a white middle class life that I had known basically, and that exists in South Africa in certain ways, which are in themselves like not unproblematic, and maybe some sort of like leftovers from apartheid, especially at that time in like 2011. But yeah, again, I didn't strike me as a massive cultural difference. I think the main difference really just was the like the institution, the school where I just spent most of my time and ultimately got very serious about studying. And then also ultimately the other thing that year did, again, less so because of the cultural difference, but like you kind of realize that you're on a clock, right? Like you've got 12 months and you know that you're going to leave at the end of those 12 months. And like at that date, you're going to go. And that whole year, which is always going to be super special and amazing as a part of your life, is going to end. And so I think in that sort of sets you up with a notion that like, shit, you want to do something with your time. You don't just want to like waste it, because otherwise, that this time is never going to come back. And I think in some ways that sort of flicked a switch in me, which was to realize that like all of life is like that. You might not realize it as a teenager, but the truth is this like life is extremely fleeting, and you either sort of do something with it or you just kind of like live it on default mode, which, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But like, I think there's definitely something exciting and positive about like actually like, really like throwing yourself at sort of like big questions and hard problems. And I think that sort of like is something I took away from that year.
Amazing. That's a lot of learning. Exactly. Particularly at a young age. Now you've gone to Cambridge, you graduated, you ended up at Dalberg.
Sure.
When did you click that carbon renewal was the part that you were going, that was of interest to you?
Yeah, it was an interesting one. And in fact, I don't think I would sort of have called myself a climate person sort of like coming out of university. I was always quite like sort of an adaptation optimist, being like, well, climate change is real, but like so is human ingenuity, and we'll sort of like adapt to climate change. And I guess what sort of like clicked is when there was like an idea competition that we were running internally about like, again, that sort of the question that was centered around was how do you create like 30 million jobs for young people in Africa by, I don't know, 2030, I think at the time, and this was 2020. And again, like classics, so slightly pretentious, like big picture sort of consulting question. Like having become vaguely aware of the sort of climate science around carbon removal and the world needing a ton of like durable carbon removal and like literally from a base of zero. That kind of struck me as one such big opportunity. 30 million jobs, that's an industry. That's not just like a nice sort of idea. Like it's an actual, like that's how many people work in the global garments industry. And I kind of realized that carbon removal could be that. In some ways, it has to be 1% or so of the global economy by 2050, give or take, for us to allow ourselves to sort of like, to hit net zero emissions globally, and then to sort of start cleaning up the mess that we have made of the atmosphere. And it kind of struck me that it's just like a massive sort of opportunity basically that like we've never seen. And so that sort of like made me sort of very enthusiastic to kind of like really like explore this topic further, and I did over years. And I think sort of I grew into this topic around carbon removal and some sort of carbon credits, carbon markets, and so on a lot more while at the firm. And I think it was like a quite a helpful topic to be smart about, because there was always somebody like, again, it's like carbon credits like a sort of like a very nebulous topic, and there's always somebody like, hey, like, Martin, can you tell me about this carbon credit thing? And then like, how could like we were thinking about this idea, could this generate carbon credits, and so on and so on. And so yeah, I mean, I helped sort of various other teams around the world to like think through these things. And then yeah, eventually I kind of realized that direct air capture in Kenya sort of a really unique combination there, and I resolved to move my life to Kenya to sort of like really try that. And I didn't expect at the time that I would sort of like focus fully on this idea so soon. It was funny, I was slightly snubbed for promotion. I mean, not that I have like any hard feelings left. I mean, I just transferred region and a few new people didn't know me and so on. But like at that point, I was like, well, actually, maybe I'll do this entrepreneurship thing a bit sooner than I otherwise might. And I think the realization I had then, I think this is maybe something that's helpful to people listening is and who are maybe just interested in entrepreneurship, is that like I told myself at that time, well, like you've got a decent job here, like you could stay for another 2 years and build up more of a financial cushion and like gain more networks and become smarter and this and that and so on. Or you could just start now and struggle for 2 years. But the chances are that in 2 years' time, you might actually well be in a better place than if you just like sort of took the safe path for a while longer. Plus, like the other thing is that like if you want to take the safe path, truth is you might never take the hard path at all, basically, right? Because those opportunities that you see, they might be fleeting again, and like other people might go after them and so on and so on. And windows of opportunity is always closed. So in some ways, like there's no substitute to just taking the leap. And that's essentially what I did in about 2022.
But, at that point when you take the leap, obviously, as a human being, you would have doubts. How did you walk through your doubts? I mean, for some people, they'll say, I have my pros and cons list, I have my backup. For you, how was your decision-making process like?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it was a really like active discussion with my wife as well, right? Because initially we just planned to just be in Kenya for a bit and then, maybe like go back to Europe, like settle down and so on. But I had sort of realized that I was onto something, and that also like, for some reason, I used to think that you can just do a startup remotely. You can't. Like it actually takes a lot of you in person, especially as sort of CEO. And yeah, I think the thing that sort of like convinced me to take the leap, I mean, it was definitely like we were in a good position. And I think in some ways, like unknowingly, I had sort of like done the work up to that point, which is that like having a financial cushion definitely helps. It helps to sort of make that decision. And again, for me, in some ways, that was forced because it was the COVID lockdown. Both my wife and I were lucky to like work through the COVID lockdown, but we also always like kept our expenses extremely low. After we got married straight out of uni, like at 23, and at that point we moved in together, kept our expenses very low, and we lived on 2 incomes and were able to save up a lot of money. And so yeah, I started like when we came to South Africa, I had about $50,000 or so, which helps again. And then to be clear, that is all money that sort of we saved up in the sort of like 3-ish years or so before then. Yeah, and again, and then COVID definitely helped because it wasn't anything that you could have spent that money on. And I guess ultimately, it's, again, I think most people listening to this, again, they probably like have, some decent education, at least like some sort of like degree and so on. And again, like, I mean, for me, again, there was maybe also like an extra security, which is that like, having a sort of, Cambridge degree, I kind of like knew that like, I could just probably find a job if I needed to, and if this thing doesn't work out. And if I blow my savings, so be it. Like, I was never really like fixated on, getting a mortgage and getting a dog and getting a car or whatever, and just like doing the whole like classic thing. And yeah, I think in that sense, like just sort of the beware of the hedonistic treadmill, which I think is sort of like classic sort of like entrepreneurship thing. Just be careful to not like lock yourself into like high spending, because you might very quickly get used to that, and that will make it a lot harder to sort of like live off like minimal income for a while when you're just starting out as an entrepreneur. And then also like, yeah, I mean, your choices matter, right? Like what you chose to do in your sort of like teens and like early 20s and so on, like has an impact on your ability to start a company later on as well, right? Like, if you worked hard to sort of like get a really good like university, if you work hard to get a really good degree, If you have some sort of relevant job experience, that sort of provides a cushion and something you can go back to if stuff fails. All that sort of like helps you make that decision. It sort of takes out the risk somewhat. And so I guess for us, again, I think in some ways, like, again, there is some risk, again, like you sort of risk some sort of like savings. But again, at the end of the day, as long as you're young, again, you kind of like your biggest asset is yourself and your time, right? Like, and you can sort of always like go back, get a job, and still, save up for a pension that might be smaller than otherwise would be, but who cares? As long as you don't need to like drive a Lambo, then you're fine. So that's kind of like the approach that I took, I guess. I'm not sure if that's helpful.
Very, very, very helpful. This is very good. Thank you for sharing. Now, Kenya, we've had conversations before, and you've talked about how Kenya is ideal for DAC, for the listeners, direct air capture. So energy, geology, talent, and the likes. How did you see all this combined to make it Kenya the most ideal place to build this?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So yeah, I think, again, this is like, there's an actual sort of like story like to how to start. Like at Dalberg, at some point, we were sort of mapping out carbon removal potential across Africa, and we were only looking at sort of nature-based solutions at the time. But I thought, like for the heck of it, I mean, let me just compare a couple of countries on things that might matter for direct air capture, like the right geology to store carbon, like the right energy potential to actually run their day capture machines and renewable electricity. And so I realized that, again, there's no place on the African continent like Kenya. And then I sort of widened the analysis at some point and looked like, is there any other place in the world that is like Kenya? And I realized, no, there isn't. Shit. Kenya is actually very unique in this way that it has a very renewable grid. It has a lot of geothermal. It has a sort of very young population. It's very well educated and a good ease of doing business. Ultimately, just like the right geology to store carbon as well. And ultimately, the other thing is that like there's sort of really strong co-benefits from doing their day capture in, say, Kenya as opposed to in Iceland, which is where the world's first air capture and geological storage plant is. And again, in that sort of like there's co-benefits. I mean, that sort of carbon speak for saying like, there's this positive like effects from you deploying this technology where you're deploying it on income, so like poverty eradication and so on. And I guess what I just realized is that like this matters, but it also really matters to like the buyers and investors and so on that sort of like want to sort of put money into this. I think all those sort of things lined up quite well. So there was both the sort of the actual sort of like work stream where sort of this realization sort of like started happening. This was in 2021, just before that first sort of like plant started coming online. And I think like, whispers were growing a bit louder that direct air capture could be interesting. So yeah, I think I sort of started looking into it then. But again, this is in 2021. Very few people had ever heard of that technology. There were like probably at that time still, I want to say like 300 people globally working on the tech or so. Like this is like tiny, maybe 500 if you count academia, but like, and it was really tiny. And even today, it's a couple of thousand max. So yeah, it's definitely been a sort of like creeping realization that I think something that like just like occupies you. And in some ways, it's funny, like when all you ultimately think like, why do people start businesses? I mean, I learned at some point, like, about a year and a half into actually running Octavia, that some people start companies to make money. And I kind of found that funny because like, I was like, this is like a horrible way of making money. Like there's a much more reliable ways. If you want to be an investment banker or something like that, it's a much more reliable way of like making more money than you could probably spend, or than I could anyway spend. But I realized that like there's just like this opportunity that starts obsessing you basically, right? Which is kind of like, this thing is real. This could be so big. This thing, if it is real, like the world doesn't look the same basically. And like, we fix climate change. We sort of like end the fossil fuel age. Like this sort of stuff could be like massive. And I guess it's one of those things that just really started obsessing me. So yeah, I think it just kind of like sort of really started putting more work into it. Started networking and started like meeting people who are already in the space. For anything that anyone is thinking about doing, there's always online communities that sort of like help you think through stuff. Like get in touch with the nerds and sort of like really think through the tech and all the problems and details with it. And yeah, that's basically where we started in late 2021 after I moved to Kenya. I think that started crystallizing really, really quickly as well.
I think this kind of feeds into that argument or conversation around missionary versus mercenary. And I mean, from an investor perspective, I always have to answer this question: am I investing in a missionary or am I investing in a mercenary? And honestly, I don't think that there's the best answer to this, because at the end of the day, it's about the end result, which is making money. But
Absolutely,
like
yeah.
you said, what is the long-term impact of what you're building and how does it benefit everyone?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I don't know, like, I mean, it's rare that like startups like are easy money, right? Like, I mean, if they are, then like, like congrats to you. You're just brilliant. You found something that nobody else has thought about. But like the truth is that like very often like this stuff is really hard. And again, if it was easy, somebody would have done it. Like some established company would be doing it. And so again, like I'm never quite so sure about people telling me, oh, like this thing is just a money spinner and so on. Like it's easy. And then they like there's always the slightly suspicious startup pitch, which is where you hear like somebody's like 3 months old and they have like $800,000 in revenue. And I was like, wow, like good on you. But I'd like to know a bit more about those numbers, which is kind of like, again, like this stuff tends to be hard. And so I don't think there's like either sort of like way which is the right answer to it. It's not like I don't care about making money. I think what I realized like in the aftermath is that like you work so hard on it, you give up so many parts of your life. You sort of give up talking. Well, I mean, like for me at least, I significantly reduce how much I can talk to family, how much I can talk to friends. I have my family and my wife, and now we also have a son, and I have my colleagues. But that is my entire life. Like there's so few in the line of hobbies. There's so little in line of getting in touch with family and friends and so on. It's all basically Octavia. And so in that sense, like you really have to have something that sort of like keeps you going when times get tough, because they will. And I think in that sense, like realize both that there is no easy money and that like you kind of need something that like you care about when things get hard. And so I think quite often the mission carries you through. And I think at the end of it, like it's more that like the money is like something that like is a right reward for like the amount of effort that it takes. Basically, that's kind of how I think about it these days. It's kind of like it's so hard to really like build a highly value-adding business. Again, especially like in a sort of technology startup kind of space, and especially in deep tech, even more so. Like society is right to sort of shower those who can sort of achieve it with riches. And again, we are very far from that point. But like I think in some ways, like looking around the people and the investors and the folks who've backed us, I'm seeing examples of this where I'm like, okay, yeah, they are right to have an easy life now because they sort of poured their life and soul into something for a long time. So anyway, I don't want to go into too many tangents. I know we want to get to the meat of the matter, which is Octavia, but just another reflection there.
I do love your reflections. Now, as founders and anybody starting anything, you already have an assumption, maybe based off your experience, based on your interaction with the market, based on your research. Are there assumptions you had around direct air capture and even Octavia at the beginning that you have revised at the moment?
Yeah, I think the one thing that is really key to realize, especially in hardware startups, is, again, I mean, it depends on the industry, I guess, but for us, the assumption I walked into Octavia with was that there's people who know how to build their data capture machines, right? So like the solution is we want to do that in Kenya, so find people who build those machines, convince them that Kenya is the world's best place, and then just get them to ship their machines here, and we'll just make a business out of it here, right? Well, wrong. The thing I realized is that very often in hardware startups, like you actually have to do the work yourself, basically, right? There's no such thing as just like going on Alibaba and buying the thing, basically, because again, that is likely too easy for the thing that you're trying to do. And yeah, I think that was big realization that we've had. So we actually like pivoted very quickly from just wanting to be a project developer to being a technology developer as well, and have since sort of developed patented hardware. Extremely proud of what we're building. Like even it's kind of a bit of a running joke inside Octavia, because like if you look at the stock image of their data capture machines, they all look the same. They're mostly containerized. They like kind of like fans on the outside. That's basically it. Octavia's machines look very different. They're cylindrical. Like you kind of see that we start with very different first principles. And I think that is like really starting to pay off in the performance numbers that we're seeing. So it's something we're quite proud of, and think something where, again, like doing the hard work pays.
Yeah, again, I'm really, really proud of all that you've done, because
Thanks,
apart
man.
from the fact that you've taken, an interesting approach to solving this problem, you've used mostly local teams to pull this off. And I'm always in spaces where we talk about the level of African talents, the amount of work that has to go into upscaling them. Do we even have African talents to help build in the deep tech space? But you've really, really built out your company with predominantly local talent. How have you pulled this off?
Yeah, no, it's a thanks. And thanks for being so open about asking a question. So just for context, like Octavia today is like 54 or so Kenyans and me. So like again, like everyone in the team except me is Kenyan. And look, I think in some ways this is like, maybe it's like partly history. We again just met Duncan when he was still at university, and I think we started building a team from the people he knew who happened to be Kenyan. And those were sort of focused initially around the University of Nairobi, and then we sort of started growing from there. And we were always sort of like quite cheap as a startup, I guess. And the thing that is like we realized very quickly is that, well, expats are like very expensive. So I think in some ways, like maybe some of the incentives we've been given there from like the national government and others like just work. But I think also like, again, for the realization that I sort of had about, especially once we became a technology developer, is that like what we're building here is a BYD. What we're building is a Samsung. Like it is like a global South based hardware startup that wants to compete globally and wants to win globally. And in some ways, you also have to realize that like there is businesses where, again, like you like generally like you start the assumption with like, okay, I'm starting this business, I just want to find great people to run it and so on. But the point is that like the talent that you want might not exist yet, and you might have to sort of like shape that talent yourself to the image that you sort of want to see. And I think for me, again, like what do like Samsung and BYD and Toyota and like lots of these like admired hardware companies have in common? Well, it's fucking hard hours, basically, right? Like it's really like hard work to actually like just win as a hardware company if you have like the whole world against you, right? And I think that was definitely the case for all these sort of East Asian success cases that we know and speak of today. And I think in many ways it's also the case for the African success cases that we want to build. Do you think that you can sort of like I don't know, I mean, again, this might be different startup to startup, but my take on this is that like, if you think that you can sort of compete globally by like, you know, building in Kenya or Nigeria or South Africa, and you're going to work like 48 hours a week, then you're probably dead wrong, right? Like look at the companies that have actually done it, and you'll see that they work extremely hard. And I think in some ways, I was maybe a bit pessimistic about our ability to find local experienced talent or expats for that matter, that would be able or willing to work that hard, at least for what we are able to pay at that time, right? And even on some level, even today still. And so I think in some ways I always like found it very precious to just kind of build that culture, like you know, from the bottom up, basically build a culture of like really hard work, where I think leadership really sets the pace on what hard work looks like. For Duncan and me, that's about 85 hours a week or so. And there's very clear expectations, like from the leadership downwards, basically, how many hours that should be. The base expectation is 50 hours a week for everyone. And then again, for most people who have like more responsibility, it's more. And I think by being clear about this and by being clear about what we're building, I think we're able to sort of build culture differently. And sort of I joked with the head of operations recently, which said that probably the best way that you can sort of get 5 more years of experience is to just work for another 2 years at Octavia. Because again, like he's 25, but he's built like the world's second day capped geological storage plant, right? Like there isn't many contexts in which you'd been able to do that. And there's certainly not many contexts, at least in Kenya, that would prepare you for doing that. So in some ways, we always found it better to just kind of have like young, sort of coachable and extremely hardworking talent, hiring the sort of very best from the universities that we have locally, and just kind of really like throwing them at these hard problems, linking them with sort of mentorship and consultancies from abroad that sort of can help them on like specialist topics, and even just like to brainstorm and think through and sort of like mentor and grow themselves. But for the most part, again, this is us. And in some ways, like, maybe it's different for an industry as new as direct air capture. I mean, like Octavia has something like, I want to say like 3 to 5% of the global like direct air capture workforce. And it's not because we're huge, it's because the industry is still tiny. And direct air capture is not like that many other things that you could be doing, right? And so in some ways, like you build it from scratch anyway. So in some ways, I think the culture is much more important. And at this point, again, we're seen as global experts in what we're doing, and increasingly consulted by experts for that expertise. And it's always a bit funny when people realize how young our team is. But yeah, that's that. And so I think, again, I've talked a lot about like, you know, like the sort of the culture that we're building. And then like, you know, that's in some ways less specific to the question of like experts versus local talent. My own experience is that like it's hard to like build a team like this and making a very compelling offer to an expat. I mean, again, the offer is often, you know, we can probably pay you less than you might be used to earning elsewhere, or than you might be used to earning at home where you're from. And the hours are definitely going to be a lot harder. So it becomes a tougher sales pitch. And so, I mean, we do compensate with equity quite generously and so on. And so like, I don't think it's necessarily the case that we'll never sort of hire any expats, but at least at this point, we haven't really sort of found that worthwhile. And there's definitely lots of like advantages to having local talent as well. I mean, for one, I mean, local talent doesn't leave, right? Like they're very much committed to actually seeing this thing through and sort of seeing in Octavia a vision of what they want Kenya to be. And the fact that we can build that, I think also like really like shines through to a lot of our stakeholders, our customers, our investors, and so on. All of them are quite inspired by what we've been building. So It's ultimately, again, like I can't take too much credit of it. It's just that the team has been amazing, and we've definitely like really put a lot of emphasis on like long hours and coaching. But I think that has given us pretty decent results so far. But I think ultimately it does come down to what do you want to build and what is the closest benchmark to that. And I think, again, if you look at that for success cases elsewhere for deep tech hardware companies, that's essentially what we've modeled after.
Every business has a time where there's crisis. Have you gone through that phase where you had a crisis that actually tested your own conviction in your vision?
I mean, definitely. There's this slightly infamous inside Octavia, but the one that we've had was about a year into building Octavia. And it was exciting. We had something like, I think, $300,000 or so worth of investment at that point, which was a lot for us at that time. And we were sort of building hardware, and they can build hardware is expensive. So this was great. So we essentially landed our first customer who would actually prepay $300,000 for carbon credits that we deliver in the future. And this was huge for us, right? You've got this first big contract. It's amazing. It got confirmed in early May. It told us we'll have the money by June. Great. Like, what do? You sort of go out, you sort of like hire more people, you build more machines, you sort of do everything, and you just really want to charge ahead, build as fast as possible. And the thing that happened is that it like May turned into June, and we sort of like saying to people, hey guys, by the way, can we sign this contract? And then didn't quite happen. And then like in July, now everyone was gone for the summer. Again, most of these customers were European, so they were pretty much out for all of July and August. Yeah, I mean, and July came around, and then again, we had sort of budgeted payroll until July because surely those guys would pay by then. Like one of those guys was literally a bank. And yeah, and then somehow like that payment didn't come until late August. And so when it came to the July payroll, I essentially just kind of like had to take up a big sort of like loan myself on my personal money. And I had to sort of convince both my sister, my dad, and my mom to sort of for my parents, like my dad was retired, and both of them, again, they don't have much money. They usually live hand to mouth most of their life. But to convince them to tap into their pension savings and to like put up like a couple of $1,000s each for Octavia at that time, without really fully understanding what I do for a living and so on, which was definitely like tough. And this was like the real test. They're risking to lose face with everyone, right? Because it's not like for my dad, again, like it's not like starving or anything, but like this is the difference between whether he gets to, like have a holiday that year or not, basically. Right? He's definitely not a wealthy guy by any stretch of the imagination. So that really tested my conviction. But yeah, I mean, the money did come through eventually. And so I think just kind of like going that far into the red on everything and sort of communicating that with the team. And of course, the team is like, what the hell is going on here? And but that was probably the biggest test. And yeah, I think in that sense, the biggest lesson there is that be scared of the summer. If it's just starting out, like you might like want to like charge ahead, and you might not even know what a summer is if you live in Kenya, frankly. But like those European stakeholders, they can really screw you over, basically. And July and August are going to be like really slow months. And if you like bank on your investment round closing in July, then you're gambling your company without knowing it. Same for us at that time. And I was like young and ignorant and didn't realize this. That next payroll, because again the payment came in like the last week of August, and that week is when payroll was due. And I was like, what do we do at this point? I mean, I was like, sort of desperately reaching out to our current investors to kind of like give us like loans and extensions and like somehow allow us to meet payroll. But yeah, eventually like that, all of a sudden there's $200,000 in the bank, and the stuff is sold, and you get back to building, and it's fine from there. But yeah, I mean, that was a big test of my own conviction at that time.
That's actually a really nice story of the trenches. The part people don't see. Everybody sees that bright, shiny, company, and people don't see the amount of tough decisions you had to make behind the scenes. What is your most contrarian view about climate tech in Africa?
It's mostly fintech built on Chinese hardware. I mean, this is like slightly demeaning. Again, this might sound like it's not value adding, but I think again, in many ways, I think the opportunity there is to really actually create jobs around manufacturing and research and development and so on. And I think in Octavia, we're a rather rare sort of instance of that happening. And in many ways, in e-mobility, you'd probably be an idiot trying to compete with the Chinese, for example, because they're just so good and at such a massive scale that like competing with them is probably foolhardy. And again, the much bigger competitor for you in that case will just be the fossil fuel economy that you're kind of like used to tackling. But yeah, I think in some ways that is, I think in some ways, I think there is probably room for more ambition across Africa. And I think Kenya is an exciting place because I think it's something where that increasingly happens. And I think that Kenya and some other countries in Africa have, that very few places on earth actually have, is clean, firm power, like renewable energy, like 24/7. And there's a lot of things you can do with that, like like day capture, green hydrogen, synthetic fuels, and so on, that don't really make sense where you don't have that endowment. And that can be a massive sort of like leg up to people just like wanting to build big, ambitious businesses. And Octavia is definitely one of those, but I think there's a lot more room to like really think a bit more deeply about all the technologies. Like in some ways, the clean energy transition is interesting there because like there's so many unsolved problems. Like every single ton of CO2 has to disappear from this economy. And you can really ask yourself, okay, where is that? Like, what does green mining look like? What does like a green like refining look like? And all that sort of stuff. And there's so many unsolved problems there where I think there's real opportunity to actually build like hardware, like from scratch, from sheets of steel and sort of, in our case, precursor chemicals in Kenya and in Africa. That's, I think, something that I would keep in mind. But I think no offense at all to people that's sort of like import Chinese hardware. In many cases, that's the right thing to do, and there's a lot of good businesses that can be built off the back of that. But yeah, I mean, it's just a different type of business basically. And I think in some ways, I think there's room for more ambition.
Wow, we've spent the last 45 minutes having some really, really great conversation with Martin. Martin, we're going to go into our rapid fire round before we round off with our last question. And basically, the rapid fire round is just me asking you really short questions and you give short answers. Drum roll. What is one book or one person that shaped your worldview?
How to Avoid a Climate Disaster by Bill Gates.
What is one person dead or alive you would like to meet?
Octavia Butler, who the company is named after. He's a science fiction author in the US who was the first to write about climate change.
Interesting. What is one piece of advice that you would give your younger self?
As the company grows, team management is going to become extremely important and not always a pleasant part of your job, but neglecting it will only make things worse.
Interesting. What's the biggest myth about carbon removal?
That direct air capture is unfeasible because it takes a lot of energy and is expensive today, and that we can all do it with nature. I mean, there's so much we could go into there, but I'll leave it there.
What's your favorite South African meal?
My favorite South African meal? I like the chakalaka with butternut. And some mealy bread. This is what we had sort of quite often after school. It's basic, but it's amazing. People might expect me to say braai or something, which is also great, but chakalaka, the butternut
I
one,
was expecting braai, actually.
with mealy bread. So yeah, put those in the note.
All right.
So it's just it's a kind of vegetable stew in a tin with like some maize bread for the uninitiated. Like, yeah, very specific.
Thank you so much, Martin. And so our final question, and I ask this to everybody that comes on the podcast. So between power, fame, money, and pleasure, which of these is most important to you and which is the least important to you? Power, money, fame, pleasure.
Probably money, mostly because you can exchange it for the others. And doing like the conversion the other way around doesn't work as well in either of those directions. Yeah, I mean, just be a decent guy. Like, I'm not. I mean, it's not that I care about like get the sort of the vain things that money can buy, like the Lambo or the Porsche or whatever. It's more just about like money, whatever you care about in the world. Like money is a way of like seeing more of it. And for me, again, that probably would be like African deep tech venture capital, of which there's very little, and I can tell you very well. And I think if I had more money, I would probably put a lot more money into that. We could have that, and hopefully it's like turning the way of like developing African economies a lot more. But again, that's something that I would definitely like money for. But again, like use it whatever you think it's impossible, what it's important for. But again, don't sort of be shy of saying that money is important.
Money is top of your list. The top. What's the least important to you?
Probably pleasure. This sounds like I'm a quite hardcore person. And I think in some ways, like, I think, you can sort of like, you should try to find pleasure and meaning in your work. And I think just trying to find outside work is inevitably going to lead you up with something like hollow. It's a bit like, trying to get somebody to like love you or something like that, right? Like you can't force somebody to love you, and trying to do so only makes it worse, right? And I think likewise, like trying to force yourself to have pleasure basically is a way of only like ending up into like a bad place, in some place where you're like vain and hard and unloved ultimately. And I think in many ways, like the means to get pleasure is to just like put in the work in your relationship, in your work, in more broadly. And so ultimately, like if you can find pleasure in those things, then it will be a more sustainable type of pleasure that can sort of like sustain you, hopefully, like into old age and beyond. So that's sort of my take on this.
Lovely, lovely insights. Thank you, Martin, for spending the last 48 to 50 minutes with us. I'm sure the listeners gained so much from all you shared. Thank you once again.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it, man.
This has been the Grinders Table podcast, bringing you unfiltered insights from Africa's most compelling founders and business leaders. If you had found value in today's conversations, here's how you can help us amplify these stories. Take 30 seconds to share this episode with someone in your network who's building, investing, or curious about Africa. You'll be amazed at how many life-changing connections start from a single shared conversation. And if you're feeling generous, a quick rating and review goes a long way. It helps more founders and business leaders discover these powerful insights. Until next week, keep grinding.